The largest heist in human history didn't require a single getaway car. It required a ledger. $45 trillion. That is the amount Great Britain systematically extracted from India over 2 centuries. We're told empires are built on grit and superior technology. That's a lie. Empires are built on the clinical liquidation of someone else's wealth. In 1700, India was the world's bank, a manufacturing titan accounting for 25% of global GDP. Their textiles were called woven air, so fine they could pass through a wedding ring. Their steel was the precursor to modern nanotechnology. They were the center of the world. But by 1947, when the British finally packed their bags, that 25% had withered to less than 4%. India didn't just fail to keep up with the Industrial Revolution. It was the fuel for it. It was dismantled, piece by piece, to fund the rise of the West. Economist Utsa Patnaik recently calculated the total bill, $45 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's 17 times the current annual GDP of the entire United Kingdom. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was an accounting fraud, spanning 2 centuries. And the thief wasn't a king or a general. It was a firm, a joint stock corporation called the East India Company. To understand the theft, you have to understand the thief. In the 18th century, the East India Company wasn't just a business. It was an anomaly. Imagine if today, a hedge fund like BlackRock or a tech giant like Google had its own nuclear-armed military, its own courts, and its own right to declare war. That was the company. By 1765, this private firm, operated out of a small, cramped office in London, commanded a private army of 260,000 men. That was twice the size of the actual British National Army. These soldiers weren't fighting for God and country. They were fighting for dividends, for the quarterly returns of a few hundred shareholders who had never set foot on Indian soil. Before 1765, they were just beggars at the gates of the Mughal Empire. They wanted what India had: spices, silk, and that legendary woven air of Bengal. But they had nothing India wanted. Europe produced nothing of value to a sophisticated Eastern palate. So, the British had to pay, and they had to pay in silver. For decades, the company hemorrhaged bullion to buy Indian luxury. To the board of directors in London, this was a failure. They didn't want to trade, they wanted to take. Then came the Battle of Buxar. The company's private mercenaries defeated the Mughal forces. They didn't ask for the emperor's crown. They didn't want the responsibility of ruling. They asked for the Diwani, the right to collect taxes. Suddenly, a for-profit corporation was the tax collector for the richest province on earth. A hedge fund had just acquired the IRS of Bengal. This is where the corporate monster showed its true face. The scam was breathtakingly simple. The company would collect taxes from the Indian peasants, taking about 1/3 of everything they earned. Then, instead of spending that money on the people, on grain, on irrigation, on safety, the company's accountants used that tax revenue to buy Indian goods for themselves. Think about the cold logic. They took the Indians' own money, used it to buy the Indians' own products, and then shipped those products back to London to be sold for a 100% profit. It wasn't trade. It was a circular laundering operation. The Indian weaver would work 14 hours a day under a flickering lamp. He'd pay a tax to the company. The company would give that same money back to him to buy his silk. Then they'd sell that silk in Europe for gold. The weaver was essentially gifting his labor to a private firm in London and paying for the privilege of doing so. But it went deeper. To ensure India couldn't compete, the company began the process of de-industrialization. They didn't just want India's goods, they wanted India's market. In London, they passed laws banning the wearing of Indian silk. In India, They imposed massive duties on local manufacturers while allowing British machine-made cloth to enter tax-free. They broke the looms. There are accounts of weavers' thumbs being chopped off to ensure they could never work again. And the silver, the bullion that used to flow into India, it stopped entirely. The company had turned an entire nation into a giant, self-funding supply chain. In their ledgers, they recorded these as exports. In reality, they were the spoils of a corporate raid. But a corporation has no soul. It only has a duty to its shareholders. In 1770, the rains failed in Bengal. In any normal civilization, a government would lower taxes to help the starving. They would open the granaries. But the company wasn't a government. It was a profit-maximizing machine. Their primary concern wasn't the 10 million people dying in the streets of Bengal. It was the dividend. Instead of helping, the company raised the tax rate to 50%. They needed to make up for the loss of dead taxpayers. They even sent their private soldiers to force farmers to grow opium and indigo cash crops for export instead of rice. While parents were eating their children to survive, the company's directors in London were celebrating. The stock price was soaring. Profits were at an all-time high. This is the sobering reality of the Industrial Revolution. London didn't become the center of the world because of free markets or Protestant work ethic. It became the center because the company liquidated an entire civilization to fund it. Every grand Victorian bank in London was built with the interest from a loan that was signed in Indian blood. The capital stolen from Bengal didn't just stay in England. It was exported to fund the railways of America and the factories of Germany. The modern world was built on an Indian grave. By the mid-19th century, the corporate monster had become so bloated and corrupt, it was eventually absorbed by the British Crown. But the logic of the company lived on in the halls of Parliament. They introduced a new financial weapon: council bills. If a merchant in New York or Paris wanted to buy Indian tea, he couldn't use his own currency. He had to buy council bills from London using gold or silver. That gold stayed in London. It was used to balance Britain's own trade deficits with the rest of the world. The merchant then gave the paper bill to the Indian farmer. The farmer took that paper to the local colonial office to trade it for rupees. And where did those rupees come from? From the taxes the farmer had already paid. India was effectively paying for its own exports. The gold never touched Indian soil. India was the ATM for the entire British Empire. It funded the British Navy that kept the world safe. It funded the colonization of Africa. It funded the wars against China. Then came the home charges, a bill sent to India every year for the service of being ruled. India was forced to pay the salaries and pensions of the very soldiers and officials who were occupying them. India even paid for the building of the India office in London. It was a debt trap. India was paying its own captor for the cost of the handcuffs. Even in its final years, the spirit of the company, the logic of profit over life, remained the operating system of the empire. In 1943, during the Bengal Famine, Winston Churchill didn't see human beings. He saw assets and liabilities. To support the war effort, the British implemented a denial policy. They didn't just take the grain, they destroyed the boats. In a riverland like Bengal, boats were the only way to transport food. When told that 3 million Indians were starving, Churchill ordered the remaining grain to be diverted to European stockpiles. Not for immediate use, but for buffer stocks, in case of future need. He famously asked, "If food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" To the empire, India was just a warehouse to be emptied. The 45 trillion wasn't just a number on a balance sheet. It was the stolen potential of a civilization. It was the scientists who were never born, the factories that were never built, It was a centuries-long harvest of human life, shipped to London to build someone else's dream. Even the railways, the great gift of Britain to India, were a financial scam. They were built using Indian tax money, with a guaranteed 5% profit for British investors. It was the ultimate corporate subsidy. If the railway failed to make a profit, the Indian peasant paid the difference. If it succeeded, the British investor kept the money. The tracks were laid not to connect people, but to extract resources. India was paying for the very tools used to rob them. But the era of the company is finally over. Today, the tide is turning. India is no longer a balance sheet to be manipulated by a boardroom in London. It is a re-emerging power. It has overtaken the United Kingdom to become the 5th largest economy on the planet. By 2030, it will likely be the 3rd. But the leaders in New Delhi haven't forgotten the ledger. They know that the global financial system, the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT system was built by the heirs of the company. They've watched as Western powers use debt, sanctions, and currency manipulation to maintain the same old hierarchy. And they are opting out. India is hoarding gold at record rates. They are building their own digital payment systems, like UPI, that bypass Western banks. They are trading in their own currency with dozens of nations. They are joining the BRICS Plus alliance to create a new center of gravity. They understand that in the 21st century, true power isn't about who has the most guns. It's about who owns the accounting. It's about ensuring the gold stays where it is earned. The 45 trillion will never be repaid. There is no court that can enforce a debt that large. But the corporate monster has finally met its match. The ledger is being rewritten. So, we're left with a sobering lesson. We talk about free markets and meritocracy. We look at the poverty in the East, and we wonder why they couldn't develop like the West. We lecture them on corruption and fiscal responsibility. But how can you win a race when your opponent started with a $45 trillion head start? And you started with your pockets turned out and your feet bound. The wealth of the West isn't a miracle of innovation or democracy. It's a legacy of the ledger. And the poverty of India wasn't a failure of its people. It was a manufactured product. History isn't just about heroes and villains. It's about who controls the flow of capital. If you follow the money, it doesn't lead to a temple or a palace. It leads back to a corporate boardroom. So, here is the question. Can a global system built on 3 centuries of stolen capital ever truly be fair? Or is the current rise of the East, the hoarding of gold, the rejection of the dollar, the new alliance is not a threat, but simply the bill finally coming due? Is the world ready for the reckoning? I read every comment. Tell me your verdict below. Now, let's see if the vault can stay closed much longer.